There are so many ways a Xenoblade quest can be good. They can be epic, wide-reaching stories that tug on your heartstrings, and explore sci-fi and fantasy concepts that you could never even dream of, or even more charmingly, be the writer's take on a favorite trope or series of their own. They can bring new lore to the table, cause you to think about philosophy, the world, and yourself differently. And sometimes they just introduce you to an extremely cool woman with an extremely cool robot that you're absolutely going to stop, stare, and say, "Whoa, cool robot" at, while not thinking about anything deeper, and then also the rest of the quest line actually involving deeper thought and stuff like that. We're talking about Liesel today. Could you tell that? I'm not sure. Of the two new playable ladies, Liesel's stuff is a lot more self-contained and disconnected from the main plot and lore than Nilnail's was, so for the vast majority of this video, I am not going to need to spoil anything beyond her 2 affinity missions and all the required story stuff you need to get there. So Chapter 9, plus a girl's wings, and then the 2 Liesel missions, though there will be a full spoiler for everything including the epilogue section at the end. Even though it is the most unique game in the series, I think there are a lot of ways where you can say that the Xenoblade series really began to find its formula with Xenoblade X. Namely, by fleshing out its world with a lot of party members, the vast majority of whom are optional, and all of whom have a few voiced side quests to get to know them. They start as affinity missions here in X, and then are turned into Blade quests in 2, and then Hero quests in 3, and I think the formula was largely refined as the games went on, with 3s being fully voiced, having really high production value in cutscenes, and effectively being directly tied into the main plot on a lot of occasions. All that goes to say, even though it's restricted by the bounds of being a Xenoblade X affinity mission and not something from a later game, Liesel's First is one of my favorite of this type of quest in the entire series. Liesel and Alicia are both extremely likable characters, and I'm sure their entire plight is something very relatable to a lot of people, regardless of what sector they actually work in. This is an example of something the Xeno series does a lot, where it will have a certain aspect that is definitely intended to be critical of one specific thing about the world, but is also relatable in a more generic sense. Kelemen is not exactly the most subtle piece of commentary in the series. I mean, they made him look like that for crying out loud. And the vast majority of people playing the game are not going to be employees at horrendously corrupt tech companies run by incompetent man-children, but anyone who's ever had a bad boss who won't treat anything they do as satisfactory, especially if they're in a field that involves creating a product or providing a service that they take pride in, can certainly still relate to these two. I do also see another parallel that's been pointed out: Hresvelg as a metaphor for game development. Alicia, the developer, is cooped up inside, crunching her brains out for who knows how long, for an ungrateful boss who does not care about the quality of the final product or the enjoyment of the customer, only profits in getting things out as soon as possible, and it takes someone like Liesel actually pulling her outside and allowing her to touch grass for her to remember the merits in what she's creating in the first place. From what we've been able to glean from interviews, this is not what Monolith's relationship with Nintendo is like now or ever has been, but they've certainly recruited people from other developers in the past, and I could see the overall theming of this questline being an echo of the last few staff members who have been around since the Xenogears days, continuing to be bitter about how that project went down, which, honestly, even after 27 years, I cannot blame them in the slightest. Remember, the reason Xenogears is the way it is not because of budget reasons, it's because they were given a very strict time limit in which to make the game, and they ran out of time, not money, to finish things. So they weren't allowed an extension, and then it seems like they were even strung along a little bit when it came to a sequel, only for, and I kid you not, Final Fantasy The Spirits Within being why the sequel plans were shelved, which is why we have a Monolith Soft today. The reason why it's so easy to read into this as something connected to art is because these characters are developing a weapon. And especially in media that's as anti-war as the Xeno series is, you don't usually see characters have the specific kind of conviction Liesel and Alicia display when it comes to having their projects finished, if they're ones that are designed ultimately to kill. It's not that it doesn't make sense for them to be this attached to a project they've been working on since Earth, it's just the lack of any specific Oppenheimer moment, especially when Hresvelg is pretty clearly the Zeta Gundam of Skells, that's a bit surprising, I guess. It's not a term exclusive to creatives by any stretch, but Liesel does even directly use the term burnout, which can definitely up the relatability, I think. Oh yeah, I almost completely forgot. It's time to introduce the Xenoblade X version of this now.
Yo, you want to play some Xenoblade X today?
Woo!
Awesome. Wait, is Xenoblade...
Ultimately, their notion of sticking to their guns and seeing this project through to completion no matter who tries to keep them down is a very simple one, but it's sufficiently inspirational and works well enough for the story it's in that I don't think simple can be considered a bad thing here. It's extra frustrating knowing Alicia's stuck on this one project because she is a very competent engineer even outside the realm of Skells. In an option in her first heart-to-heart, Liesel will even mention that her pilot suit was custom-made for her by Alicia. I don't know, maybe the new company they form at the end of the mission is going to start with clothing instead of just full-on making a new Skell. I doubt they're going to immediately have enough money to launch into full production of one of those when they start. Her second heart-to-heart, on the other hand, has a couple examples of something very, very rare in Xenoblade X, and that is direct mentions of countries other than the US, and a little bit more background on what Earth was like prior to the start of Project Exodus. While the world's governments were aware of the impending alien threat, and they did eventually come together to form the Coalition, which oversaw Project Exodus and launched the ARC ships, while also distributing resources and things like Skell training and stuff like that to everywhere around the world, that was not a smooth process. There was definitely at least some kind of large-scale war in between the governments finding out there was an alien invasion coming and them actually showing up. It is extremely heavily hinted, especially in other military-based characters like Doug and Lau, that there are many members of Blade who are combat veterans, not just from the battle over Earth, but from fighting on Earth against other humans. Now, we don't know if this is true for Liesel herself, as she is 5 years younger than Doug, so she might not have been in the military at that point in time, but we now do know how exactly the Coalition forces were formed. Individual countries picked out their most elite soldiers to join the unified Coalition forces. And based on how Liesel talks about being German and being scouted for the Coalition forces, it seems like countries were still considered to exist. The concept of the nation state did not melt away under the threat of aliens or something like that, and humanity didn't harmoniously come together to try and fight them off only to fail at the end. Earth was still largely Earth, and this does go along with the thing I've always assumed, which is that the Coalition government itself was more of a power-crept United Nations than any brand new organization made specifically to oversee Exodus. In one dialogue option, you'll also learn that while Liesel is German and was scouted out of the German Air Force to join the Coalition, Alicia is Indian and was working for their government before voluntarily joining the Coalition, in hopes of doing something to contribute to the good of humanity overall. This is neat for a few reasons. First off, it does confirm what a lot of people have been wondering about. It was not just Americans aboard the White Whale, but Coalition members from all over the world who happened to be assigned to the new Los Angeles ship. Ordinarily, we get introduced to a character like Liesel, be like, okay, that is a German name. Is she German who happened to be on a US ship? Or is she a German-American who was born in the US to begin with and lived her entire life there? But here, we do just straight up have confirmation that, yep, people born in other countries did make it to the White Whale, and that's not including refugees from the conflicts that were definitely occurring on Earth before all this happened. Honestly, this is just really, really great canon backing up for a lot of headcanons people might have about their crosses or other OCs that have to do with Xenoblade X. Like, now you have just explicit confirmation in-game dialogue to back up your character not being American and still being on the White Whale and able to interact with the actual characters from Xenoblade X instead of having to invent an ARC ship from another city or whatever. And I also think it's cool just to have India specifically get shouted out here. South Asia is not really a region that's referenced a lot in Xenogames. Like, yeah, there's some Buddhist stuff, but that usually comes via Japan anyway. And the only other character that I could really directly tie to the region is Sharla from Xenoblade 1's Japanese name being a character from the Mahabharata. That piece of heart-to-heart also does seem to confirm that Alicia's affection for Liesel did not start with the two of them being stuck together as the last remnants of the original Hresvelg dev team, but that they were attached to each other ever since they met and were on the old team. Liesel says, the actual meeting was pretty much just chance. Ever since then, Alicia and I have been joined at the hip. And sure, it's been a bumpy road, but I've enjoyed every mile. She also ends that dialogue option with, and it looks like we can keep going. Alicia matters so much to me. And just so you know, you do too. Like, this is the second heart-to-heart in a row that has a dialogue option that is just her gushing about Alicia. So she does end up throwing in a, by the way, I do also think you're cool, to mend our bruised egos or something like that. I don't have nearly as much to say about the third heart-to-heart, but it does confirm that Liesel, a German who is going to be born in roughly 2029, is familiar with contemporary English language Reddit lingo, and also that her and Alicia are literally roommates. So yeah, about that. The game does not explicitly say they are in a relationship together, but come on. I know my opinion on this is not exactly the one that should matter the most, and some people definitely would have preferred if it was outright stated, but I'm of the opinion they intentionally chose not to do so for comedic purposes this time. Remember, this is the game that has Mia's second Affinity mission. It's the one with Laranara and Laramara, and the Definian romance subplot can go several different directions depending on what choices you make during those missions. So it's not like there isn't precedent for them being explicit with it, but also because they're not explicit with it, they can have their affinity chart relationship be besties in quotation marks, and then later change to partners because, you know, they went into business together and nothing else. Did I mention that they live together, and there are 2 separate heart-to-hearts where you can make Liesel just start gushing about Alicia, and also in the third heart-to-heart, she's about to completely crash out because she made her upset once. Basically, what I'm saying is that if we don't get a wedding in X2, they better at least give us a rom-com prequel manga taking place on Earth, where the total whiplash between the rom-com elements and what's actually going on in the world is part of the gag, because, like, seriously, how did Air Force veteran and ace pilot Liesel get tea and coffee mixed up? Just smell them! We know Mimiosomes can do that, come on! My original intent for this video was to end it with me sarcastically bestowing Liesel with the award for most heterosexual Xenoblade character of all time, but I've realized recently from people reiterating theories that I've said completely as a joke and not seriously at all in videos as if they were something I genuinely believed, that my sarcasm is nowhere near as obvious sounding as I think it is when I'm saying it. So hopefully me over-explaining this joke I chose not to make is as funny as it would have been if I did make it, and it was clearly understandable. Speaking of more Alicia stuff, while the second Affinity mission is definitely a bit of a step down from the first one in terms of overall quality, I am a pretty big fan of its rather nuanced take on forgiveness. Basically, every time something like this happens throughout the entire Xeno series, the person who did something wrong is either instantly forgiven for everything they've did and it's never really brought up again, or they die before anyone's even able to make a judgment on whether or not they'll be able to forgive them. While the mission does end very soon after, and we never really get any dialogue from Liesel about what Alicia's been doing to earn her trust back or to make up for what she did wrong, the fact that Liesel wants to be able to forgive her eventually and is going to work together with her to make sure that happens is a lot more mature and, I kind of have to say, realistic than a lot of other depictions of stuff like this. Also, wow, a soon-to-be whistleblower was assassinated, and it got covered up as a suicide when they were about to leak details about a flying machine that did not have necessary safety precautions applied to it. I wonder what that could be about. X's commentary and themes have aged really well for, like, the worst possible real-world reasons over the last 10 years, and then they just kept chucking more on top of it in DE. In the conversation where she admits her complicity, Alicia does once again seem to indicate that, at least as far as she's concerned, her desire to finish the Hresvelg is not to finish what their entire team started, and not even because more and varied Skells, especially one like the Hresvelg, which is designed for ace pilots, will genuinely save a lot of lives, but specifically because she wants to see what Liesel will do with it. I also would not be surprised at all if one of the manipulation tactics used to get her to agree with going along with all this was someone threatening Liesel. And by the time they stopped doing that frequently, she was too deep in to be able to get out on her own. You'll notice I didn't bring up Kelemen at all, and that is pretty much by design. He is similar to most of Mobius from Xenoblade 3 in the sense that he is an extremely realistic kind of evil, but in terms of analyzing from a story perspective, it is both very difficult to get any depth or nuance out of him, and also gets more depressing the more you compare anything about him to real life. The Xeno opinion that makes me the most genuinely angry is when people say Mobius is bad because they are unrealistic, when the entire point is that they are an unabashed, unsympathetic evil that is extremely realistic. But I'm not about to extend all of that to Kelemen, because he's in like 3 scenes compared to Mobius getting an entire game focused on them. And in this case, either ignoring or just making a bunch of memes clowning on him is, I think, more appropriate anyway. I do, though, think it's really funny when he starts malding at the beginning of the second mission because Lin came up with the flight module before they were able to perfect the cruise mode. Because, well, the thing they're working on is an objectively better version of the regular flight module, and the person to invent it was Lin, a member of Blade who was not working with another contractor Granada would be competing against. Plus, it is in fact technology that could be given out to every single Skell. Also, there's the fact that as far as arms manufacturers go overall, yeah, while Granada's not exactly in the lead when it comes to Skells, they are leaps and bounds ahead of literally everyone else. The Restfelg is the only model of Skell in the entire game that was not developed by Sakuraba Industries. They are squarely in second place, but also so obscenely far behind first that they're likely to never catch up there. So he really doesn't have any reason to be that angry about any of this stuff other than existing to hate, or because shareholders are somehow even more irrational than him, which, you know, kind of does sound like something that would happen. Based on dialogue, it really does seem like the Restfelg was unintentionally made underpowered, or was supposed to be as good as other Skells in canon, but was nerfed because it's already the best exploration Skell. But honestly, if there was a throwaway line somewhere to indicate that the low performance and paper-thin appendage HP on the Skell was just because of the lack of safety precautions and bad quality control, I don't think I would be as disappointed at how lame it ended up being to actually play in the long run. This only goes for combat, of course. The cruise mode is absurd and one of the coolest things I've ever done in a video game. Like, full stop, this was the only thing in XDE that managed to completely trigger the sense of wonder I got from flying a Skell the first time in the original game back in 2015. And I really, really hope this is a premonition for something to come. I am of the belief that the Pawn Spectre mechanic from Future Connected existed as a way to test a lot of characters on the field in battle in preparation for Xenoblade 3 having a much larger party size than any other game in the series. And if we extrapolate stuff like that to X Definitive Edition, well, the big new technology pushing thing in the entirety of XDE is nothing from the epilogue. It is the Restfelg cruise mode, and being able to go that fast without breaking the existing world design. I really hope this too is a prototype for the next Xenoblade game that has mechs in it, and this is another reason why I really want a Xenoblade X2 specifically that follows up on the gameplay style of the original X, because this just would not hit the same in anything other than a full open world. And I don't think if they were going to call it Xenoblade 4, they'd make it a full open world. And this brings me to the spoiler section of the video. So if you do not want spoilers for the epilogue, don't watch the rest of it, because I'm about to talk about the ending and what Liesel, and by extension Alicia, could have to do with future games in the series. Basically, unlike Nilnail, I do think Liesel and Alicia's character arcs are largely complete just based on these 2 affinity missions, but I also think they're well liked and important enough where they could still stick around in a future game. I'm not sure if Liesel is likely to ever be playable again, especially because she does stay completely independent and does not join Blade even after the second affinity mission, but I definitely think the new company they form will hopefully at least get a proper name, and be an arms manufacturer if that's a mechanic in another X game. The thing about them leaving Granada is that it seems like they were the only people left there to begin with who could make an entire Skell frame. So there's not going to be another model of Restfelg from Granada because there's no one left who could make it. And that coincidentally means, going with the theme that some of this was an analog to the development of Xenogears, the only way we're getting a second Restfelg in another game is if Liesel and Alicia make a spiritual successor with their own separate company. Boom! There we go! Xenosaga mentioned again in yet another video that has absolutely nothing to do with it. Will I ever stop excelling when it comes to shoehorning it everywhere? The other thing that makes me think we might see them again is the fact that Al's name is specifically dropped for the first time in Liesel's first affinity mission, kind of for no reason. Yeah, the reason that's the only time his name is mentioned is because they hadn't chosen what name to give the hero character back when they made the original game, and this is one of the very few new pieces of content, but why did they need to say it at all instead of purely saving it for a surprise in Chapter 13, Act 1? Well, Alicia tries to compare Liesel's piloting skills to Al, but the two of them never interact. There's also the fact that concept art for the Hresvelg in the original art book states that it was going to be the Skell of the Black Knight, which is what that book referred to the character who finds Lao on the beach as. Now, I do believe that the Black Knight and the hero were always intended to be the same character, and I do have an entire theory about how they changed up certain story elements that led to the Hresvelg not being a Skell Al used at any point in time, and that will probably end up in the Lao character file video because the Al one is going to be way too long if I include it there. Anyway though, Al was supposed to pilot the Hresvelg at some point in development, possibly one that even predates the Wii U version of the game, so they do technically have that in common as well, which makes me think we're actually going to see Liesel's piloting skills go up against Al's, and we might even get to see a sparring match, similar to the one we ourselves get to do in Al's first Affinity mission, between Ares and Hresvelg. And then also there's the fact that if cruise mode is a prototype for what the next Xenoblade X game is going to include, it doesn't really make sense for anyone other than Alicia, quite possibly with an assist from Lyn, to be making all of these new Skells that can all do something similar to cruise mode in the first place. I'm gonna say this every time. I'm not confident enough to say that all 3 brand new party members in XDE exist solely as foreshadowing for future events, and Liesel is probably the one I'm the least confident about overall, but I do have faith that if we do get a direct sequel or anything reasonably close behind following up the events of Chapter 13, we are going to see Liesel and Alicia again. I'm not going to say it's going to be the next video to come out, but I will be rounding out the character file trilogy of the new party members before I move on to people who were in the original game like Alma and Lyn. Until next video though, whatever it will be, you will see the tears of time.